Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books Network. This is New Books in Eastern European Studies, and I'm your host, Jill Messino. Today, I'll be speaking with Valentina Glajar about her new book, The Secret Police Dossier of Herta Müller, a file story of Cold War surveillance, which was published with Camden House in 2023. Welcome, Valentina.
Oh, but thank you so much for inviting me and for being interested in my book.
Well, it's such a pleasure that you took the time to speak with us today. So just a little background on Dr. Glajar before we begin. She's professor of German and honorary professor of international studies at Texas State University. She has published work on German language literature from Central and Eastern Europe on themes ranging from Herta Müller, the Holocaust in Romania, and Western representations of East European women. She has co-edited 2 books on surveillance in Eastern Europe: Secret Police Files from the Eastern Bloc Between Surveillance and Life Writing, published by Camden House in 2016, and Cold War Spy Stories from Eastern Europe, published by Potomac Books in 2019. So, Valentina, can you tell us how you came to write this book?
So this is a long story, and it started actually in grad school. The first chapter of my dissertation was on Herta Müller. And actually, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, showed me Der Mensch ist ein großer Fasan auf der Welt, which was translated as The Passport. And I read it and I couldn't put it down. And in some way, I could relate to everything she was writing. So then I decided, okay, one of the chapters will be on Herta Müller. And then once I was done with it, I didn't quite go back because, like you said, I wanted to do other stuff, like about the Holocaust, about the Romanis, and so on. And then she got the Nobel Prize. And as we probably know, and this is the case with so many other Nobel laureates, nobody knew who Herta Müller, or very few people knew who Herta Müller was. So then Bettina Brandt and I decided, okay, we need to come up with a volume on Herta Müller to have Americans actually also get acquainted with her work. And while I was doing that, one of the contributors, when she sent us the contribution, her chapter, I realized that she had seen Herta Müller's file. And I was very intrigued, obviously, and I wanted to see it as well. So then she explained to me what the whole process was, and I finally got to see it, I think it was 2011, because, of course, I had to be accredited first as a researcher of CNSAS, the Council, okay, let's see if I get it right, the National Council for the Study of the Securitate Archives. So that took a while. So anyway, in 2011, I think I finally saw her file. So as you can see, it's been a long story. I also wanted to make sure that I know what I'm doing. And with the work I have done for the other 2 volumes on secret files, it made it easier for me to come back to it. And because in the beginning, I don't know, you just read the files voyeuristically in a way, because you do not quite know the structure, you do not quite know how the secret police worked, and so on. But I approached hers from the perspective of literature, because I had read all of her books, so for sure. I was looking for information in the file regarding various things that she had mentioned, mostly in interviews and essays and so on, not necessarily fiction, but fiction as well. So, then in 2019, I was so lucky to get this ACLS fellowship, and I could write it. So I started on like January 2nd or 3rd and finished a decent draft by the end of December. So in a way, that was my Corona book that kept me safe and kept me, I don't know if I should say kept me insane. But anyway, yeah. So there was the long and simplistic story, so to say, of how I came to write the book.
That's really impressive that you were able to write it in a year. And I guess that's a plug for the ACLS. They need to be offering us more grants because I know they limited the number they have. And so it's good to know that actually a year can be sufficient for writing a solid draft of a manuscript. So I would like to talk a little bit about the context in which Müller grew up in. So she's an ethnic German from the western part of Romania, from Timișoara. And can you tell us a bit about this community? So what was it like to be an ethnic German when she was growing up? And maybe also even give some historical background on the ethnic German community in Romania, because of course they've been there a long time, and then kind of how they've been regarded, especially because their past during the Second World War is a little bit sordid, and even during the late 30s. So maybe talk also a little bit about their involvement with the Nazi regime during the Second World War and just Romanian attitudes towards this minority.
So for anyone who has read any work of Herta Müller, they would know that she is from a village which is called Nitskidorf, from the county of Timiș. And she grew up until I think she was 14. She grew up in this village. She was an only child. And then when she was 14, she went to high school to Timișoara, Temesvar, or I don't know, I forgot what its name is in Hungarian. Anyway, so she went to high school there. So she has talked a lot about this difference from this ethnocentric community where, as she mentions, only the police officer was Romanian. And I'm not sure that that police officer actually lived in Nitskidorf or just came from time to time. I have no idea. But anyway, so she has, especially in her first volume, Niederungen Ideas, it has been translated. She talks about this two kind of, so first the ethnocentrism in her village, and then coming to Timișoara, where she experienced the surveillance of the Securitate, but also felt a lot like this little girl from the village who had to adjust to city life. In terms of, so she's a Banat Swabian, one of the ethnic minorities in Romania. As far as I know, and I'm not a historian or a linguist and so on, but I know of at least 4 ethnic German communities in Romania. So the largest one are the Transylvanian Saxons, and they came, I think, in the 12th century or so a very long time ago. And the other one, the next one in terms of size, would be the Banat Swabians, who belong to the Danube Swabians, who are also in Hungary, in Serbia, and of course in the Romanian Banat. 2 other minorities that I know of, ethnic German minorities, would be the Landler, not too many of them, and they are mostly in Transylvanian Saxon villages. And then I also know of the Zipse, and the Zipse lived in Maramureș in the northern part of Romania. So anyway, that's why it's good to say German communities, because they tried, and we use them also today because it's easier saying German Romanians or Romanian Germans, depending on the perspective. But that's a blanket term that encompasses all these other smaller or larger ethnic German communities. The Banat Swabians came a lot later, mostly in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, and many of them were invited actually by Maria Theresa, the Empress, to populate that area and really to drain the swamp. But I mean, literally, not metaphorically. So many of them actually, I think several waves of them actually died of various diseases and so on. But they built a very thriving community and beautiful villages. What else can I tell you? Oh, yeah. So in 1943, many of them joined the Wehrmacht or the Waffen-SS because they had a choice in 1943 to stay with the Romanian army or to actually join the German army. And many of them, I don't know if it was always voluntarily, had to join the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht. And then when they, many of them never returned from the war. So they either went to Germany, and then we have the whole family reunification that started in 1945 because the families were left behind in Romania. So now they wanted them to relocate to Germany. And before the war was over in January 1945, basically most women and men between the age, and I might be wrong, but 16, 17 to about 40, 45 were deported to the Soviet Union, then many to Ukraine for reparation work. So they came back, many of them came back very, very late. Some of them even 1950, 51, 52. And I don't remember the percentage, but quite a large percentage also lost their lives there. And then for the Banat Swabians, there was another deportation in the 1950s, not for all of them, but for the ones who were in the border region with former Yugoslavia now. And it wasn't just Banat Swabians, ethnic Romanians as well, and I suppose ethnic Serbians and so on. So they were relocated to Baragan, which was a very arid zone. And again, many of them died there as well. But then they finally could return and get their houses back and so on. So it's a very, very, very long story, and I'm sure a historian can do it a lot better. But this is more or less the history that Herta Müller grew up with. Her father, she mentioned that many times, her father was in the Waffen-SS. Her mom was deported to the Soviet Union. So in a way, this history was part of her biography, and she writes about it also a lot, mentioning both her father and her mother. And then, of course, her latest novel, Atemschaukel, which was translated as The Hunger Angel, deals with the deportation, and especially with the story of another famous German-Romanian Oscar Pasteur, who was deported as well. And she had begun writing this book, The Hunger Angel, with him. And then in the process, he passed away. So then she had to rewrite and actually finish the book on her own. And then, of course, she got the Nobel Prize.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the time when Müller was productive writing, when she began writing in Romania. What was it like to be a writer during this period? So mid to late 70s into the 80s.
So a lot, I mean, the whole period. Okay, let's go back. So from 1949 until 1977, censorship was an institution in Romania. So that was quite important for really any author, not just the ethnic Germans. So Herta Müller started basically writing at the end of the 1970s. And then, of course, her first book came out in 1982. In 1977, censorship was abolished, more or less, the institutional one. But what it really meant was, okay, the task of censoring was taken over by the editors. So censorship existed even after 1977. And she definitely mentions this a lot about having been censored by various editors. There is not enough information or evidence to support her claim, because there is no more archive of the Criterion Press where she published two of her books. So in my book, I try to compare various stories that were first published in a journal, then they were published in the Criterion edition. So there are many changes, but it's not very clear which changes were because she rewrote the pieces and which ones were censorship. But in any case, in the 1980s, censorship still existed. In terms of publications for ethnic Germans, so they had the publisher, the Criterion publisher that I just mentioned. And then there were sections for German language books in Timișoara. And there was Fakla. The press was called Fakla. And then there was another one in Cluj also, and there was Dacia. But those were just sections of larger presses that published mostly Romanian books. So in other words, publishing was quite difficult, I assume. First of all, you had to go through this whole self-censoring because you wanted to be published. So I assume that was the first step. I have no idea. That's not something that you can actually trace. That would be probably for Herta Müller to say. And then the next step for her, for example, would have been the editor who would say, okay, this cannot fly. You have to change this or that, and so on. So the one very clear censored word in her works was Russia. So Russia had to be censored, especially because it meant the deportation. So there was one thing, and that can be traced. And then the next step would have been, senior editors who would look at the corrected or whatever censored version, and they would either say, okay, let's have it published, or let's have it sent to the next, what was that, the Committee for Socialist Education or so. So those were the last ones to actually have books published or not. So it was quite a chain, and I assume that she has done that. In her file, there are a few documents that talk about that, especially one at the Criterion Press, where she was quite unhappy with some changes that they wanted, and she fought for her text and for the integrity of her text. So we don't know if she was successful or not. Yeah, so that was pretty much it, I think, in the 1980s.
So many layers of evaluating and editing and redacting parts of the text, so that it often comes out a lot different than it initially appears. I'd like to move on to the surveillance of Müller now. So the Securitate, the secret police in Romania, began surveilling Müller in the early 1980s, and her code name was Cristina. So can you tell us a bit about the Securitate and, just how many people were employed full-time for it? And then how many informers were collaborating with it? And maybe, place it with respect to other security forces in the Eastern Bloc.
That is quite interesting because, so what we know about the Securitate was founded in 1948. And as we know, in 1989, after the whole revolution, it basically changed its name to SRI, the Romanian Service of Information. It had various directorates that dealt with various aspects of life and of surveillance. So for intercepting, for example, correspondence, for technical operations, which meant bugging and wiretapping and so on, or counter espionage and so on. So various directorates. So it was like a network. Each of the counties then had regional so-called directorates, but they called them services. So it was a mirror structure of the headquarters in Bucharest, basically, but they called them services. And they had, obviously, the various counties had to report to the headquarters. And then, of course, smaller places had local, not as sophisticated and not that many services, but anyway, they had also their local Securitate guys. There are various numbers that circulate, but if you look at the CNSA side, at this point, I think they have like 11,000 officers that are on their list and a lot fewer collaborators. I think 5,000 something collaborators, which of course does not mean that there were only that many, because the highest number that I have seen is like 500,000. I don't know, maybe there were that many. I do not know, but at this point, CNSA is adding very slowly names to the list, because I don't know about how they add the officers. I know from my research that in one of the files that I have been working on, one of the officers is missing from their list. I don't know why or how they add them anyway. But with the collaborators, it's a little bit different. In order to be called a collaborator, you have two conditions to fulfill in the court of law. So one would be, okay, you submitted, you supplied, you provided information to the Securitate on various people. And second, they have to prove that it was an anti-communist stance and that the rights and freedoms of various people were infringed and limited and restricted. So if both conditions are fulfilled, and that has to be simultaneously and cumulative and so on, then you can be called a collaborator. So that's why it takes so long, because many of them, it's very easy to prove, okay, yes, they have provided information because we see their information and their informative notes, reports, and so on in the various files. But then to also say, okay, they infringed their rights, that's harder to prove. So I have seen also certificates where, okay, if one condition was fulfilled, then they would have a certificate saying, yes, they have submitted information, and that's what they did, and that's the extent of their informing, but they cannot be called collaborators. So it's a complicated scenario, and that's why I do not know what the exact number is. It is most likely, okay, if we look at the number of files that have, okay, so that's another answer or question. We don't know if all the files are still there. But anyway, if the available files amount to about 27 linear kilometers, apparently, versus 180 linear kilometers of Stasi files, so the East German files. So in a way, there are a lot fewer. I don't know if we had fewer informers, collaborators, or officers, but the output is quite different in size.
Right. I realize it's challenging because we don't know what has been hidden from view, what was destroyed. And so it's a different situation, too, because, of course, there was the reunification of East and West Germany, right? And so then it's in different hands there. And in the Romanian case, it's, the files are left to different authorities. So
and that's true. And the new Secret Service has actually, I think they are claiming that 99 of all the files have been transferred to Chen's house. And actually, I think in 2021 or 2022, a large amount of, many files were transferred indeed. I was just hoping that Herta Müller's case officer, that his file would be among them, but apparently not. So I don't know if it still exists or not. Sometimes in my experience, I would ask for files like 3 times, 4 times, whatever, every single time. And then I would get the answer doesn't exist or no answer at all, which also meant it doesn't exist, or I don't know what it means. But once I was lucky. So after 3 tries, I got the file that I wanted. So maybe his file is also somewhere and they still need to find it, or maybe it doesn't exist anymore, or who knows?
Yeah, it could be a number of explanations, but obviously persistence worked in one of those cases. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the files. You mentioned that you read them as a literary scholar, so from the perspective of the literary scholar. But maybe you can talk about what they look like and how you are able to glean information from them. And this kind of goes along with my follow-up question on this, but you could probably combine the two. Kind of what are the challenges in trying to construct some type of portrait out of the surveillance of Müller and her partner, Richard Wagner, based on these files?
So the files differ, obviously, first and foremost, because you have the surveillance files like Müller and Wagner and so on. Then you have the network files, which are the informer files. Informer files also have to have, or if they do, it's very lucky for the researcher. They have a Mappe Annexe called an annexed file with all the informative notes that the various informers have written. And if you get those, that makes your life a lot easier. But in many cases, the regulation was that after 5 years or so, they would be destroyed. So I don't know why. Maybe they had too many and didn't have enough space. I have no idea. But sometimes, of course, they did not follow regulations. And lucky for us, they're still there. So they have, the ones that I have looked at, maybe also because they are from Timișoara, or even those that I looked at from Brașov, from a different Transylvanian Saxon, originally Transylvanian Saxon city. They are mostly handwritten, which makes your life even more complicated. I noticed that many from Bucharest, for example, those would be typed, which again is a lot easier for people who look at those files. So every single one, I mean, the officer reports are handwritten. The informative notes, the informers' reports are handwritten. The transcripts of the wiretaps or of various recordings are also handwritten. So sometimes you get used to one of them, like the case officer. I could actually tell it. I mean, read it in the end, even though some of the words I had some problems with. But so those are the files that you're looking at. So in the very beginning, like I mentioned before, when I looked at the file, I didn't even know what to look for because sometimes, okay, they are chronologically ordered, which again would make your life easier. Of course, the recordings, the transcripts are from, so the first one, no, actually the last one is, okay, I don't remember, but the order goes counterintuitive, which also makes your life more difficult. So you read them and it takes a while. It took me a while, at least, to figure out what the structure is. And it's almost like a book. And if you have, for example, 1 or 2 months of various things about Müller, various notes, and then you would have one officer report that would, in a way, summarize everything that has happened or that they have found out until that time. And then they have action plans. So at the end of the report, so what should they do next? Assign tasks for the various informers and so on. So like I said in the beginning, you read them and in a way you think, wow, I have access to this person's life. Okay, skewed and so on. I mean, from the perspective of all these people, so very polyphonic because everyone has a different perspective. And I have a problem with generalizing that information was fabricated and so on, and it was false, and it was this. I'm sure that there are many instances when that was the case. But what the Securitate did was, okay, if I'm an informer and I inform on this event or whatever it is that I was supposed to, if it's interesting information and one that they would like to follow up on, they would have another 2 or so informers either corroborate or the information that the first informer actually provided. So they really were interested in receiving accurate information. So from the very beginning, they would also train them to actually be accurate, see everything from various angles. And so so that's one thing that I learned by reading this. And how you read it and look, I mean, that's why I came up with this idea of a file story, because I do not claim to have composed the portrait of Müller or of Wagner during those 7 years of her surveillance. In a way, by coming up, yes, and I appreciate what people have done before me, like looking at files as sort of a biography, and they came up with very clever and wonderful ways to look at them, like an arrested biography, a hostile biography, an incriminating biography. But then biography, in a way, is so real. And yes, the files, they have real life fragments, so that they are all together in those files, but you cannot say that's the biography of anyone. So then I thought, this is actually, it's kind of a life story, but it's really a file story. And a file story, that means then that the protagonists are not necessarily the historical characters, but it's the Cristina or the Aristu and so on. Finally, the Securitate never or very, very rarely mentioned her code name. So it was always Herta Müller or it was Herta, which brings some ambiguity there as well. So that's how I proceeded with reading the files. And what also helped me was, to look at the files, not necessarily for all the gaps, because really that's the first thing. And you would really want to know that answer and what happened there. Because files, it's not like a continuous story. So sometimes they end abruptly and you do not know what happens afterwards. And you are so into the story that you would like to find out. So yes, there is a lot to be said about gaps and filling the gaps as well. And I try to do that by, asking lots of questions and trying to find an answer. But I wanted to go, to read them along the grain. So basically for all the information that was in there, not for the information that was missing. And then in a way, then you come back and also read it across the grain, because I think I read those files, at least hers, so many times. And then, it's always the fear of missing one little aspect of it. And that could just bring everything in disarray. So you're always afraid that you're missing something. And if it's not your own file, if you're a researcher reading that file, you have to put everything together. It's like a puzzle that you have to somehow assemble. So that's pretty much how I try to do it.
Yeah, so you have to be really thorough and attentive. And, when I do research in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bucharest, and I think, oh, wow, I can't get this folder. And what if that folder holds the key and brings the story together? And it's, it's frustrating. And you're wondering, am I crafting an accurate portrait, or at least a reflective one, if I don't have all the information? And so, of course, and like you said, you can't know whether or not you do. You just have what you're given. So you're really kind of at the mercy of the authorities in that sense, those who are in charge of CNSS.
The other fear is also that, so I have looked at so many files around her as well. So all her friends and so on. And then you have to read them as carefully as you read hers, because many times, not only, for very minute information, there are also documents that were misfiled and they have nothing to do with the person where the documents are filed. So many times I found documents about Herta Müller in completely different files. So that's another fear that you have, that, yes, not only, I do have the file, but I might miss something because, it's so much information. It's,
Yeah. So I'd like to move on to the chapters now. And chapter 1 tells the story of the Niederungen, so lowlands. And that book was published in Romania in 1982 and in West Berlin in 1984. So what is the significance of this publication for Müller, and how is it presented in the files you consulted?
I think it's the most consequential book that she has written. It changed the trajectory of her life, of her career, of everything. It made her known in West Germany while she was still living in Romania. It also attracted the Securitate and brought the whole surveillance upon her. So I think it's so very important. So it was quite revealing for me to find out how she actually started to how she was actually allowed to travel to West Germany. Yes, she had the various invitations. Yes, she had, she received awards and so on. But still, she was living in communist Romania, and it was quite difficult to actually travel to the West. So in the various files that I have looked at, it was mostly sources that could actually travel and that had various missions or tasks and so on. So then I found out in the file that there was a certain meeting, and the legend, so the pretext or the story around it was that she was called to the Department of Education to because she needed a job. So during this meeting, it was so the representative of the education department was actually an undercover Securitate officer, actually a woman, one of the very few women that I encountered in her file, who was a lieutenant colonel, so quite high up. And the other person that was there was Paduraro, the case officer. So the question was basically, are you amenable to being influenced positively? And so that's, the jargon, to be influenced positively, which means, okay, don't write political text or so to tame her writing outputs in a way. So it was a two-way street in a way. So she wanted to go to West Germany, and there is this officer who was a lieutenant colonel as well, who was actually also amenable to allow her to do that. So that's how it actually started. We do not know exactly what date that was, because various dates, but anyway, it was at the end of August or the beginning of September. And school was supposed to start on September 15th, so that was before that. And then she was allowed to go, I think in September, on the 26th or so of September, she was allowed to go for the first time to West Germany. And I think it was because she was supposed to promote her book at the book fair in Frankfurt am Main. So that was the first one. And then, there was this whole relationship going on, and she would have lots of invitations. Then she would get awards and so on. And she would have to go to him and ask him to somehow intervene or whatever and have them approved. So it all started with Niederungen, and actually the one event that happened was that she was not allowed to go to Klagenfurt, to Austria, for the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. And the other event that happened was that the ZDF, this Channel 2 television crew from West Germany, was supposed to come to film her because she was one of the finalists for another award. And they allowed them to come, and then all of a sudden, they changed their minds, the Romanians, and they couldn't film her. So there were these two important events, and Herta Müller was apparently really eager to go, and she even mentioned that she would go on a hunger strike if they don't allow her to go. And that's how the whole Securitate and the Paduraro protagonist entered the story. And then it took a whole year of various meetings. But it all started with Niederungen and with the various prizes and so on, and awards and invitations. And I think in 6 months, she was allowed to go 4 times, which is really unheard of. But like she also mentions in one of the recordings, nobody was invited that often, and it was uncharted territory for the team Securitate to have this person who is getting all these invitations and all these awards and so on, and what to do. In a way, they wanted her to go, and the whole idea was, look, Romania is so open to the West and treats its minorities very well. And on the other hand, it was, I bet the Securitate felt it was a little bit risky to just allow her to go all the time. And then at some point, when she wanted to travel and insisted on traveling with her by then husband, Richard Wagner, they did not allow them to go together. And that's when the whole relationship, that's when they broke up. So, yeah. But yes, indeed, it all started with Niederungen. And there is a lot, I mean, especially in chapter 1, it's probably not of much interest for historians, but it's a very detailed description of what happened, the various events that led to the publication of Niederungen in Berlin, in West Berlin, and the various layers of censorship or missing layers of censorship and so on. So yes, that's, I think, for her career, her life and so on, Niederungen was absolutely the most consequential book that she has written.
So you devote quite a bit of attention to Nicolae Păduraru, the Securitate officer that was involved in surveilling Müller. And you emphasize that despite Müller's position of powerlessness, relative powerlessness, there was a great deal of manipulation on both sides. So both were engaging in forms of deception and dissimulation. So can you elaborate a bit more on the nature of their relations?
It's quite interesting. Somebody who read my book mentioned that it's like a dance, so the moves and so on. I also think it's kind of like a chess game. Even though Păduraru had a lot more information about Müller and Wagner than they did about Păduraru. So it was the manipulation, like I mentioned before, they both had their interests. So Herta Müller wanted to travel, and so did Richard Wagner. He finally was able to travel as well. And Păduraru wanted to isolate the group of writers. There were quite a few then at that point, William Totok and Johann Lippert and Balthasar Weitz and so on, and Horst Samson, Helmut Frauendorf and so on. So they wanted to break them up. So, a group was not exactly what the Securitate wanted, because a group always brings all kinds of risks, and you never know what they might engage in. So it was quite interesting to me, not necessarily to see how Müller or Wagner or whatever the protagonists in those reports of Păduraru, how they performed, but really how Păduraru performed. To me, it was a lot more interesting to see how Păduraru performed. And also because he wrote all those reports, so you could actually extract whatever information you wanted about him from the various reports that he wrote. And I was very lucky that Wagner wrote a piece about one of the main meetings that he had with Păduraru, actually two of them. And that was very, very helpful to me. Number one, to realize that Păduraru was very accurate in what he was doing. Okay, he was using the language that he was supposed to, the bureaucratic, whatever lingo. But Wagner had, even though Wagner saw it differently in the sense that the meeting with Păduraru wanted, okay, let's go back. So the one meeting that was quite interesting was when Păduraru and another officer went to Herta Müller's and Wagner's apartment, and Müller was during her first trip to West Germany, so obviously it was Wagner that Păduraru wanted to talk to. So the idea was Păduraru, what he mentions in his report, which, like I said, was very accurate, was the fact that he and this specialist, this wiretapping specialist, came to visit Wagner's and Müller's apartment. It was actually Müller's apartment, to see if one of the microphones that they had installed would be visible, because they installed it through the ceiling of the apartment below and through the floor of their apartment. So while Păduraru was entertaining Wagner, the specialist, the wiretapping specialist, was looking for the microphone to see if it was visible or not. So that's what Păduraru was saying in the report. Wagner, on the other hand, said that, yes, there was just a pretext that they came to look for the microphone, because really what they wanted was to talk to him about collective memo that these writers actually addressed to the writers' union, to whatever the party and so on, about a beating that apparently took place at the Securitate. So Helmut Fraundorfer was the one who was beaten during some interrogations, and they wanted to put a stop to that. And that's why they all came together, wrote this memo, and they were then invited with representatives of the Securitate, of the party, and so on. So Wagner is saying that's why Păduraru actually came. So the basic facts were absolutely the same. It's just that, like I said, it's the perspective. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it was both. But the installing of a microphone was very important to them. And that, again, allowed them a lot of insight into the intent of the two protagonists, which was quite interesting. So not necessarily what they did and so on, but really what intentions they had. So yeah, as I mentioned, the file, I don't know if that would help any, because in the end, obviously I gave up on the idea that I will ever find Păduraru's file. That might help to have a more complete picture of Păduraru, or might not, because some of the Cadre files are quite interesting as well and really fascinating, and some are short and not so and boring. So I don't know about Păduraru, but they all put up a performance. So Păduraru often had to just, I don't know, sit and listen to them and ask the questions, the ones that he actually thought of ahead of time, and I think for at least one of the meeting, he was supposed to write down a lot of talking points and so on. So Wagner and Müller had very little information. They thought they could manipulate him, but that was not the case, because the whole intelligence was actually with Păduraru. So it was an interesting relationship, which puts a lot in perspective, especially the idea that, you were either a victim or you were a perpetrator during that time, or you were a bystander. But I think there are lots of gray zones, and it's not all that simple, which also makes everything a lot more interesting.
Yeah, and you also discuss how Pedoraru appears in her fiction. So she's able to assert her agency and in a way get back at him, right, by representing him in her fiction. So in which work do we see him appear?
It's actually not necessarily Pedoraru, so it might be more than Pedoraru. So in the Land of Green Plums, there is one, and of course in The Appointment. But she mentions Pedoraru per se, not by name, but as the officer in charge of her case, she mentions him in her autobiographical interview or so, which is really a book, the Apfelkern, so the apple seeds, where she there is a vague portrayal of Pedoraru, and he comes up from time to time, or various meetings and how she saw them and so on. So yeah, but Pedoraru per se, I can say that it was him. So for example, in the Land of Green Plums, there is a Piele, and there is also a Pele, Petru Pele, who is an officer, and he shows up in the file as well. So he was in some way also involved, but only peripherally. So, yeah.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about those who were informing on Müller. So not just, of course, the officer who was in charge, but you focus on 3 individuals. And I'm just curious about how they were selected and also how useful their reports are. How do they help you create this kind of complex portrait of her surveillance during this period?
So I think 27 or so informers informed on her. Some of them while she was in Romania, some of them showed up after she emigrated to Germany. Some of them were repeat informers, so they had informed on her in Romania. And then because they were sent with missions or whatever, they would come back with some information from West Germany after she had emigrated. But to me, 3 really stood out. So they were quite different, all 3 of them. So it's interesting cases. So the first one was Meyer. So Meyer was one of the Waffen-SS soldiers who was actually, that was the most revealing thing in the whole file, I think, or in the whole story that I have written about Herta Müller. But it was actually Meyer who, during the interrogations, while they tried to have him collaborate, we find out that he was actually a guard, a camp guard at Auschwitz, and not even his wife knew about it, so they could blackmail him and so on. He was so loyal, and his collaboration basically ended in 1989 with the revolution. So he was 77 years old in 89, and he would probably never have stopped. But
wow.
So it's just unbelievable. Mm-hmm. So his story is amazing. The file is horrible. I mean, there is no order whatsoever. Oh, and also it's only a partial file. I think it ends in 78. And because the world is so small, of course, his handler was actually Pedoraru at the end. So that was interesting. But no, Meyer's story is absolutely amazing. So he's one of them. He didn't have, actually, with the exception of maybe the last one, Eva, who was the translator from German to Romanian for the Securitate. None of them had a lot of access to Müller. So in the end, their informing career, so to say, or I don't know how to call it, was a lot more important. And their contribution to the Müller file was actually very small in comparison. So there was Meyer, and like I said, so he was interrogated, blackmailed, and I think he was very happy to just sign that agreement. So that was in 1962, which of course was the kind of end of the Stalinist era of surveillance, but still quite dangerous at that point to actually say no. But what was interesting also for him, even in 1962, there was another performance there because everything is a legend and everything has to be prepared. So nobody just comes up to you and says, oh, do you want to be an informer? Because really we need you. It's the whole vetting first. So you ask neighbors, you ask maybe even family members without their knowledge. So they have no idea why you are asking about this person. Then various other informers would write. It's almost like writing reference letters. Oh yeah, he's really good. You should take him. Not quite, because the informers didn't know either why they were asked. And importantly, in 1962, with all this, the legends, the various reports that they had to write about the first meeting, the second meeting, and so on, they always had an exit strategy, which is quite important. And I felt it was quite important that in 1962 they had it already. So they always had a scenario that they concocted to say why that person did not agree to become an informer. So that was quite important to me. Of course, if you were Meyer, you had no idea that they had that exit strategy and what that really meant. So you were just scared and just wanted to somehow go on with your life, I suppose. The second one was the story of the second one, which was Sorin. And Sorin, of course, is also connected with Niederungen because he was the photographer for the cover of Niederungen. So he got to work with Müller, maybe more involved because of this cover, book cover. I think piecing together his file story was probably the most, if Meyer's was the most revealing and most surprising for me, the one about Sorin was the most satisfying as a scholar, as a researcher, because Sorin didn't have a file. So how do you figure out who Sorin is and what he has done? So because he was a member of the Communist Party, and members of the Communist Party didn't have files, and actually to use them as informers, you actually had to ask the whatever party leadership for their approval. So they are called surse cu approbare, so approved sources, so to say. So Sorin was one of those. So he didn't have a file, so you kind of had to piece together stuff from various other sources. And the other sources were the nationalist fascist German documentary fund, which is like 46 volumes of basically the history of ethnic Germans in Romania, but it only starts in, I think, 76 or 77. And then, of course, until 89. So all of a sudden, looking through the 46 files, that each of them like 500 pages or so, I started looking for Sorin, and I found Sorin. And I realized the missions he was on was unbelievable. So apparently a smart social guy, tactful, and so on. And they used him for missions to Germany, especially to infiltrate the Landsmannschaft, the ethnic German associations there. Also for missions in Romania, especially if various television crews would come to film, then they would interpose Sorin and so on. Also because everyone wanted Sorin since he was an ethnographer and knew about Banat and Banat Swabians and customs, traditions, and so on. So there was Sorin, and Sorin also at some point emigrated to Germany. And then, of course, when he came back, he also went to the Securitate. But by then, there was no more Păduraro and so on. So everything had changed. Păduraro had retired. And all these people did not, they just revealed his identity. So it was very clear who Sorin was in the end. So, in fact, it was before then, before the end of the file, it was only 3 times that his identity was revealed, and Păduraro was one of them because of the cover, of the book cover. And then Eva, I chose her. So I think I felt quite sorry for her. I think she was fooled by what she thought would be these Securitate officers who would protect her from her ex-husband or soon-to-be ex-husband, who was also a source and whose handler was also Păduraro. And she was at this very vulnerable place in her life with the husband leaving her, and she was with a newborn child, and it was quite interesting. And the strategy of the Securitate to actually bring her to the meeting point, that tracked her there and so on, the legend was that they wanted information about the new love interest of her soon-to-be ex-husband. And it was, I think, so low. But then, it's a secret service, and I'm sure many of them do stuff like this. It's not just the Securitate, but it was really a low point. And I think she believed them or whatever it was. And I don't think that she could get out of it. I think her strategy was to translate stuff, so less information and more translations. I don't know. And then at some point, I think she outed herself to a friend and she was abandoned. And then 5 years later, they wanted her back, and she could finally then get out because she was almost getting blind, losing her sight. And she obviously couldn't translate anymore. And then all of a sudden, and it's always the case, when they abandoned them, they were the worst possible, and they didn't provide any real information. That was what they were mentioning always, real information, which just meant probably true, accurate, or whatever. In the beginning, when they are supposed to recruit them, they are the best ever. They are wonderful. They have lots of opportunities to get information. Then at the end, when they abandon them, it's quite the opposite of the beginning of the file. And so those were the 3 informers. With Eva, because of the translations, and of course she translated some of the stories that Müller wrote. I think sometimes inadvertently she changed things just because, in a way, the political context determined that. I don't know if she, like I said, I don't know if that was intentional, but in any case, her translations were important. And since Todoraro didn't speak any German, so he relied on Eva's translations. So no matter how you spin it, they were also consequential for Müller's surveillance.
Right. And it gets back to what we were talking about, the layers within these files, right? And layers within the surveillance, because you've got the reports by various informants. And then you also have those who are listening to the buggings, right? So they bugged Müller's and Wagner's apartment. And so then the audio recordings need to be transcribed. And then there's things that get lost in the transcription. And so that's a whole nother layer that you have to account for in your analysis, right?
So it was even more complicated because so there were at least two filters. So the one filter was the transcription, and then the second filter. So transcription would also happen in Romanian cases and Romanian files, Romanian language files. But then you would have, so that's already a filter, and the second one would be the translation. The problem was that the officer, which was a sergeant, and she was a woman as well, and apparently she really translated wiretaps and recordings of all the ethnic Germans in Timișoara. So I saw her name over and over in the other ones as well. She was instructed to actually only extract the hostile information, political or you name it, or intentions of immigration or what they could find out. So she would leave out a lot, which again would mean that she was framing all this information in the sense it had to, she wasn't interested. The one thing that everyone would be probably disappointed with was that she was absolutely not interested in literature, philosophy, whatever debates or discussions they had, none of them. So every time that would happen, she would say, okay, then they spoke about literature or films or whatever. And that was the end of it. Or any story that did not fit the tasks that she was supposed to fulfill and accomplish. So she had being a sergeant in the Securitate, I suppose that she was also very well trained to look for certain things. So it must have been an index of stuff that she had to look for. So in the end, the end result was sometimes very problematic, not necessarily because she left out a lot of stuff, but also you couldn't always trust her German skills because sometimes she couldn't hear it well or she didn't quite know how to translate it. I'm not sure. So there are some instances where to me it was clear that her German was not quite up to par because some of the names that maybe she should have known are misspelled in her writing. But the point is, they found out exactly what they wanted, and in the end, for them, it was most likely a triangulation of information, and in a way, it was for me as well, because like you're asking, okay, how do you piece that together? How do you find various things by triangulating everything, and you see what repeats itself and in what context and so on, and then you have like the main data that you can play with and look for, I don't know, elaborations in one document or whatever, at least another instance of it in a different one. The microphones were really crucial and very, very invasive. I think that was the most invasive layer of surveillance, because once they had both the microphones installed and they were working and so on, which again was a whole operation of installing the second one and so on, which is quite interesting also to see how they function and how they did it, how many teams and crews were there to actually have one microphone installed. So that was interesting. But it was very invasive. And once they had those installed, they relied, it seemed to me, less and less on informers, because in a way, they got a lot more and more accurate information by just listening to the two. Since informants, I mean, for example, none of them had any idea that they, or at least never reported that Wagner and Müller had their scheme of figuring out how to emigrate or how to defect. But they got everything from the recordings. So you are quite exposed, totally exposed, and you have no idea, even though sometimes you felt that Müller and Wagner knew that because, the music was on or the radio was on or whatever. And the other interesting fact was that for some reason, they did not install one in the kitchen. So you would think the kitchen was quite important during communism, but no, there was no microphone there. And the translator would always say, okay, then they went to the kitchen or then they came out of the kitchen. So it was clear that there was no recording while they were there. And I bet Müller and Wagner would have liked to know that. But
yeah, they didn't know that. But I wonder if they chose not to install it in the kitchen because they had been accustomed to people turning on the faucet when they speak in the kitchen, right? So
that's possible too. Yeah, that's possible. So there is no explanation why. They had a 2-room apartment, and there was one in each, but that was it. So yeah.
So Müller and Wagner are finally able to immigrate to West Germany in 1987. But even though they leave Romania and take Müller's mother with them, they are still being surveilled by the Securitate in West Germany. So why is this continuing to happen?
Because once they got there, they were a lot more outspoken, about, which is quite normal. I mean, more than they were in Romania, and against Ceaușescu, and about life in communist Romania during that time, and the lack of heat, the lack of food, the lack of this and that. So many West Germans, I think, actually found out for the first time from these writers who moved to Germany and were very open to giving interviews or writing articles and so on. And the Securitate was obviously not very happy about it because it feels like I had no idea. I thought the Securitate would just not care about anything because they were so omniscient and whatever. And but they cared very much about the image of Romania abroad.
It was like PR. It was public relations, right?
Exactly. So the fact that Müller and Wagner and Totok and Fraundorfer and so on were so outspoken, there was one way to, I don't know, maybe, I mean, I don't know what they could have done, but at least, so one thing that they did was the whole disinformation. So they sent various letters to the publishers and so on, to the West German publishers, saying various things about Müller and Wagner. One was also written by a Romanian writer, Damian Ureche. The letter is not there, but it's mentioned at least twice in the file, and Wagner and Müller also mentioned it at some point, so it must have been there. So disinformation was one thing, and character assassination and so on. At least they tried that. I don't know how successful they were, but there is also, I don't know if there is a C or a DF file, which is the Foreign Service, I was not able to get any, so I suppose there must have been one, because all the information I have is basically in the file that the Timish Securitate kept. So for them, it was the various, like I said, the various informants would go to the West and then come back with information. Or if Radio Free Europe had some show or something, some information on them, then that would be also in the file. Or if they publish something new and so on. But the most important information came from a friend of Müller's, who was actually, I think, the only person to visit her after she emigrated. And the friend comes up quite a bit in the recording. So I suppose they were good friends. So she went to West Berlin, but in order to go to West Berlin, she had to promise to actually bring information on Müller. And she did, on Müller, on Wagner, Frauendorfer, and Totok. Quite intense information about what they ate in the morning, the coffee, the smoking, the whatever, a lot of information. And then they used this woman, this informant, until the end of the file. So for every action plan, she was included there as well.
But it was a horrible betrayal for
yes,
Herta Müller when she found out, and just the insidiousness of the Securitate really comes out in this story. It was really tragic.
Yes, absolutely. And, for her, it was just this person, so to say. But I'm sure for many other targets, there were many friends and there were family members who so she was in a way lucky that this was the only really close friend who informed on her. Of course, it's a tragic and horrible story. And the point is also that apparently, from what Müller has written, this woman actually told her while she was in West Berlin at her apartment that she was sent by the Securitate. And she said that was the only way for her to see her. So Müller knew right there, and then apparently she kicked her out or something, and there was the end of obviously the end of the friendship. And then in the 90s, I think this woman died of cancer. So yeah.
Yeah, and back to the PR image of the Romanian government, they're concerned about it during this time because they're involved in some pretty unsavory activities. Among them, selling Romanians of German descent to the West German government for hard currency so they can pay off the debt. So they've got some dirty little secrets they definitely want to keep hidden.
That's true. And then you can, according to the price tags at the time, one could imagine that they paid about maybe not quite 8,000 Deutschmark for Müller to emigrate. So yes, it's quite interesting because rumors were circulating in Romania during that time. Nobody knew something for sure. And there was also the bribing in Romania, which was like a parallel income that would, right, I don't know, come to the government or to the person or to the, I don't know. So
there was so much corruption, right? Yeah.
Yes. The idea was to actually get onto the list that was negotiated. And Heinz-Günther Hüsch was the negotiator on the West German side, and then various people in Romania for the Securitate. So Müller and Wagner didn't want to go as part of the whole family reunification scheme that was going on, but in the end, I'm sure that the West German government paid for them. Otherwise, I don't know. Maybe they could have gone anyway, but I don't know. And they kind of went in record time, so not even a year from the time that they first applied or they first sent their memorandum to the Securitate, because apparently there was no clear path, like the process. Nobody knew what the process was until you got like the big forms. That's what they were called, formularele mari, the big forms. And those were the ones that actually, once you got those, it was almost sure that you would be able to emigrate. So for them, maybe also with the whole attention of West Germany on this writer who got all these awards and so on, and was in Romania, and it was not allowed to travel anymore and so on. So I think that puts some pressure on the Romanian government to actually let them go. So
right. Well, we should probably finish up now. It's been about an hour and a half. So I just wanted to talk about the closing of the book, the epilogue, because Müller wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2009. And then in response, a former Securitate officer claimed that she should have shared the proceeds of the prize with him. And so, my final question is, what does this reveal about efforts to reframe the socialist past in contemporary Romania and people wanting to lay claim to activities they had been involved in during the socialist period and how they believe they deserve a piece of the pie too, or recognition?
Yeah, there was, that's how I started the book, and that's how it ends, because, so Tino, this officer who wanted Müller to share it, actually not with him or with him as part of the Securitate. He mentioned actually she should share it with the Securitate. And I think what he meant by that was the fact that until The Hunger Angel, probably every single book that she has written dealt with life in Romania, surveillance, and so on. So I think that's what he meant, that her whole inspiration, in a way, which is really macabre, and I mean, it's horrible just to think about it, was, so the Securitate and all the surveillance that took place was part of her inspiration. But I want to think that he was completely obnoxious, and there is a lot more there that I cut out because I felt it was a little bit too much in what he said about Müller, and it was just, gutter language and stuff. But I think it says a lot about how Romania is still dealing with it in a way. I still want to think that this is a singular voice, because nobody was probably as obnoxious as he was. But he was trying to, like you said, I mean, to show off in a way his insider status, wow, I was involved, I know. Păduraru, of course, died, I think, in 1987, so he wasn't around. And I don't know, I didn't feel like Păduraru would probably do that. I don't know. Because Tino shows up at the end of the file, of Müller's file, and he's at that point, I think, the deputy chief of the Timiș Securitate. And after the revolution, he was actually imprisoned, and he was in jail in prison for, I don't know, a couple of years. I'm not sure. So in a way, he was now also the victim,
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah.
So that's,
the perpetrator is always becoming the former victims, depending on the regime, right?
Exactly. And then the targets are further victimized and so on, because, to me, what was also interesting was not just the fact that he came up with all these ideas, because there is a kernel of truth there. So he might still remember some stuff there, but obviously, like I mentioned in the book, a lot of it is like half true or not true at all, but yeah,
it's pretty outrageous. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. That's the word. But nobody has reacted like he did. But like I said, in the end of the file, you can hear his voice. Because when reading the documents, I don't know, maybe we just imagine how those people are, but if you read quite a few of them, you kind of see types of people. It's the same with the informants, the same with Păduraru. And when Tinu appeared in the file, he was this arrogant and loud, and I don't know. So I could see him or imagine him doing that in a way, but I think it was way over the line.
Based on his personality. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you for taking the time to speak with me about your book, and I highly recommend it to our readers.
Thank you, Jill, for listening to me for 1.5 hours.